Rotarians and Friends, Dr. Dawn Lavell-Harvard.
I guess just to share with you that it's been 49 years now since this challenge has come my way.
Jeanette walked into my office with this case, and I'd never heard anything about this issue, had never thought about it. And after we talked about it for a while, my initial reaction was, this is insane. This cannot be right.
I was about human rights, and if part of that was my wife's position on what was being done to her, and I supported all the way, but that was definitely always and still is a part of human rights.
The federal government therefore urges all Canadians to join it in settling this question without further delay by renewing our federal pact and our sense of belonging to this country.
It has done some good because it's made us as Native people really look at what is happening to us now. How can we allow a piece of legislation to divide us? It's dividing families, dividing friends, dividing people.
Today we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country.
Could not bear a system where these ideas about humanity and human rights could prevail over Parliament's deliberate and clear intention.
I think it's time that we actually stood up and took responsibility for the terrible mistakes of the past.
We actually have a piece of legislation on the books that could eliminate all the discrimination against Indigenous women and their descendants, but doesn't.
Respect our laws, respect who we are. Do away with the Indian Act, because if you do away with the Indian Act, you're also doing away with the discriminatory practices.
Once you marry out, then you're gone. We weren't banished from our people. That particular section of the Indian Act was put there specifically to diminish our people. You know, you get rid of a woman, then you get rid of all her family, her children, and future generations to come. Very crafted, I would say.
We've all heard the prophecy that says a time will come when men and women will be equal again, that our people will be strong, and that time is here. They used to say that a nation is not conquered until the hearts of its women are on the ground, and then it is done, no matter how brave its warriors or how strong their weapons. But I am here to tell you that our hearts are not on the ground.
With human rights, basic human rights has to do with basic, fundamental justice and fairness as a human being, respect to all people.
I pity the country, I pity the state, and the mind of a man who thrives on hate.
Thank you, everybody. Ani, bonjour, sego, segoli, skanagoa, bonjour, good morning. I knew if I kept going, eventually I would hit one that everybody knows. Don Harvard, Dishnakos, Wikwem Kong Donjaba. On behalf of the First Peoples House of Learning and Trent University, I want to thank you for this opportunity to be here today to share my story. I'm truly honored to be part of this very important conversation. And I want to start the conversation today by acknowledging that here at Trent University, we are located on the traditional territory of the Mississauga and Anishinaabe. And when I was asked to speak for your event, I briefly struggled with wondering what I was going to say. And when I looked at your theme that says, "Don't stop believing," I thought the best thing I can share with you is my story. And for my story began with this court case. I have volunteered. I heard Diane talking about the importance of volunteering and realized that Now, I've been involved with Indigenous women's activism for over 45 years now. And at the risk of disclosing my age, that means, I was that baby in my mother's arms. And during this whole process, as she fought for the rights of Indigenous women across Canada. And, you might be wondering again, why I showed you this video of my mom, that this was supposed to be my story. But the reason, is it because I think my mom is great and I like to brag about her, which she is, and I do. But really, I shared this story because it's an example of how one person can make a change. It's an example of how one very small person, a Anishinaabe woman from a remote reserve in Northern Ontario, took on the government of Canada and went to the Supreme Court, and eventually, even when they lost at the Supreme Court, went to the United Nations, went to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and forced a change that would allow tens of thousands and eventually hundreds of thousands of Indigenous women and their children to be reinstated to their communities. And it took these women 50 years to finally have their rights acknowledged. My mother is in her 80s now, and she said the most important thing is she wanted to see this done before she goes on to that next stage in her journey. And after 50 years of struggle, this is what Don't Stop Believing is all about. No matter how many setbacks they had, they kept fighting, those women. And so this was the beginning of those conversations. And at that time, it wasn't easy. When she, when she married and she lost her status, and they decided to go to the Supreme Court of Canada, it was not easy. The Supreme Court justice who said, we all know what it's like on an Indian reserve, that you should be happy a white man would marry you, you're better off. People in our own community who said, leave this alone, that if you don't stop this court case, you're going to start having accidents. When she said, I'm not going to stop, this is too important, that belonging to my community, because when she married my father and she lost her status, she lost her home, she lost her land, she lost the legal right to ever return to her community again. And I don't know if you can imagine what that would be like for your government to tell you you can never return to your family and community. So for her, she said, this is too important, I have to carry on. The chief in our own community said, Jeanette, this is important. You have to do this. And he said, but you understand that when we get to Ottawa, I have to toe the party line and speak against you. I can't support you. And she said, I'm doing this anyways. And she started getting more threats. They said, well, Jeanette, you might not worry about yourself, but you can't watch your children 24/7. And she said, it's for my children, I'm doing this. It's for their right to be part of their community, to be part of our family. And so she wouldn't stop. And she went all the way to that Supreme Court. Friends walking beside her on the way in to protect her getting into that building. I thought all families made, when they had Arts and Crafts Day, I thought everybody did, protest signs and placards and things. Who knew that that was only in my family? But that's, on weekends, we'd go to Ottawa and we would march on Parliament Hill and, carrying on that tradition with my children, that when there's injustice, it's important to stand up. And the most important thing we have to remember is that at that time, it was divided in our communities. Those chiefs, it was at the time the National Indian Brotherhood that stood with the government of Canada against their own women. And unfortunately, then our women realized, if there's no one to speak for our women, where's the organization speaking for our women? And if they weren't there, then fine, we'll create them. So that's when they created the Ontario Native Women's Association, the Native Women's Association of Quebec, the Indian Rights for Indian Women, and eventually the Native Women's Association of Canada. They created these organizations to speak for our women, to make space to hear our voices for our families and our children. And they got together over this one issue of the status of our women to regain their status. But once we got together, we realized that there's larger issues here. And we set out to ask our women, what is it that's preventing our families from achieving the same quality of life as every other family in this country? What's stopping our families from having that success, that opportunity to thrive, not just barely survive? And so we sat around those kitchen tables and we asked our women, and 80% back in the 1980s at the Ontario Native Women's Association, it was called Breaking Free. We did a report and we found 8 out of 10 women said it was the violence. How do you get an education, go home and study or write an essay when you're scared to go home at night? How do you go to a job interview with a black eye? How do you function when you're living in violence? In some communities, it was as high as 95%. So we started talking about the violence because this was the #1 thing that was impacting our families. And when I was in university, I remember at Queen's University, one of my professors asked me to go out for lunch. And as a university student, you're always short of money. And so you take a free meal anywhere. So off I went and, we met with the local chief at the restaurant. And we saw him there and he saw I was wearing an Onwa jacket. And, this professor introduced me. At that point, I was a youth member for the Native Women's Association of Canada. And he said, why is it you're always, he says, well, he walks up and he says, I got a bone to pick with you. And I thought, oh Lord, here it comes. What have I done? And he says, why are you people always trying to force these shelters down our throats in my community? He says, we don't need one. He says, when I grew up, our women were strong. They didn't run away. And he says, when I was a kid, if we were disrespectful, talk back, yeah, we'd get the strap. If my mom stepped out of line, he'd give her a slap. And I didn't know how to respond to somebody who the violence had become so normalized in their life that they treated it the same as ketchup. It's just something everyone has in their home. And then we realized this violence had become so pervasive. When we went to Kelowna to talk about how to create a better new life for Indigenous people, we wanted to talk about the violence. And the chiefs wanted to talk about economic development. They wanted to talk about land claims. Nobody wanted to talk about the violence. They said, don't be airing our dirty laundry. But we said, if we don't talk about this, it will never be addressed. And so we started with the Sisters in Spirit campaign. And when we started with that Sisters in Spirit campaign, we had the names of over 500 missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We were up to 680 when the Harper government shut us down because the Canadian government was starting to get a black eye internationally. People were talking about our stolen sisters and they said, you can't do this anymore. We're going to cut off all the rest of your funding. If you use the phrase Sisters in Spirit, if you do any more research on this, if you, even use the symbol and the word Sisters in Spirit, you would jeopardize your funding. And as my father will tell you, the fastest way to make sure an Indigenous woman does something is to tell her she can't. So we did it anyways. We volunteered on our own time and said, you can't stop what we do on our own time volunteering. We searched databases, we searched the internet. We were up to 800 names. And that's when the RCMP, the Canadian National Mounted Police, came forward and said, you're just a women's group. You don't have hard data, just a bunch of little women looking the internet. And they set out to prove us wrong. They were going to get the hard data. So they gathered information from over 300 precincts across the country and compiled it. And I have to admit, they proved us wrong. We had 800. They came back with 1,181 and more every week. So yeah, we were wrong. The problem was even bigger than what we had. We had just had the tip of the iceberg. But it's important to recognize that this is not just an Indigenous issue. And this is not even just a women's issue. This is a human rights issue. And more importantly, this is a national tragedy because this never has to happen. This situation where Indigenous women, we know now, experience 12 times more likely to go missing or be murdered than non-Indigenous women. 133 a year. 3 a week go missing or are murdered in this country. And I had an elder once come forward and ask me, why do you say missing and murdered? Why do you use that term? And being the smartass that I am, I said, because they're missing and some are murdered and it's nice alliteration. I don't know. I have no idea what the answer was. And she said, you don't understand. She said, my car keys go missing. My wallet goes missing. She said, my eyeglasses go missing several times a day. She said, people don't just go missing and get misplaced. She said, our girls are being stolen. They're being stolen from our families, from our communities, and from our nations. And she was right. Because our girls are being stolen. And when those RCMP analyzed their data of all those numbers they had about why this is happening to Indigenous women, they looked at what is it about you women that makes you vulnerable here, that's causing this to happen. And they looked at the data and they analyzed and they said Indigenous women are twice as likely to have income from crime. that's 18% compared to 9% for non-Indigenous women. And I thought, okay. And I thought, wait a minute. 18%? That means 82% did not have income from crime. So why are we focusing on that little small pot when 82% were working in the restaurant or the health center, or they were a student trying to get an education so they could provide for their families? And they came back and they said, no, Indigenous women are twice as likely to be involved in the sex trade, 12% compared to 6% for non-Indigenous women. And I said again, 88% were then not involved in the sex trade. 88% were just a sister, somebody's daughter, or worse, somebody's mother. And this method of blaming the victim, what was it? Something about them. They put themselves at risk. They talked about, they were under the influence of alcohol or drugs. I work at a university. I'm, talking to you right today from Trent University. And if being under the influence of alcohol meant that you're going to be murdered, nobody would make it through orientation week. So let's stop focusing on the absurd and start looking at the reality of what's happening that's making Indigenous women more vulnerable. And those RCMP said, well, Indigenous women have high-risk lifestyles. High-risk lifestyles. They're choosing a high-risk lifestyle. And I realized actually for once in my life, I agreed with the RCMP. Yes, our women have high-risk lifestyles, not because they chose a high-risk lifestyle. They have high-risk lifestyles because our girls are born at risk as a result of hundreds of years of broken treaties, of oppression and abuse in residential schools. Our girls are born at risk when they're born into a First Nation that has no clean water, that has no hydro, that has no housing, that has no jobs. Some have no road into the community, no connection to the rest of the world. Our people are struggling to survive with boil water advisories. Some communities have been under boil water advisory for 20 years. And some, the water is so toxic, no amount of boiling will ever make it clean. And we don't have, to imagine, no clean water in the middle, struggling to survive in third world conditions in the middle of one of the richest countries in the world. Yes, our girls are having high risk. They didn't choose it. They're high risk because they were born high risk. Nobody dreams of growing up and being homeless and being on the streets. Little Indigenous girls are not running around with dress-up bins full of old sleeping bags and coats pretending that they're going to be homeless. Nobody dreams of that. That's a lack of choice. Our girls dream of being veterinarians and teachers, or in my house, premiers and prime ministers or princesses. Our girls have dreams. This is about a lack of opportunity. When we have a reality where over 40% of Indigenous women are living in poverty in this country, 50 to 60% of Indigenous children are living in poverty. And I've actually always wondered how we have these studies of child poverty, because children living in poverty are not living with moms who work on Bay Street and drive BMWs. Children, we don't have little packs of boys living out in the bush in poverty. Children in poverty, child poverty, is children living in single parent families. Children living where their parents can't afford the rent and food at the same time. And unfortunately, because of this poverty, it's not surprising that our kids are currently being apprehended at higher rates than non-Indigenous children into the child welfare system. We currently have more children in the care of the child welfare system than were in the residential schools at the height of the residential school system. 30 to 40% of Indigenous children in care across Canada or of children in care are Indigenous. And in some provinces, it's as high as 80% of the children in care are Indigenous. And this is really important because when we understand that our kids are more likely to come into care for neglect, not abuse, we have to look at this differently. This is a question of poverty. Because I've worked in the faculty of education. I've taught those young teachers, I've sat in those lectures where they teach them, what do you look for? Because you have a duty to report if you suspect neglect and abuse in the home. And they teach them, if you have a kid who comes to school without a lunch, consistently. If you have kids who come to school, and this is Canada in the winter, they come to school without hat and mitts, without a warm coat or warm boots. If kids who are coming to school and they're not clean, that's neglect, right? You have to step in, apprehend, and put those kids in foster care so someone can take care of them better. It's not neglect, it's poverty. How do you provide if you don't have enough money for food till the end of the month? Sometimes those moms go without food themselves so that the kid can have something to put in their lunchbox. How do you pay to replace those gloves when your kid loses them, when you couldn't afford the first pair? How do you keep your kids clean when you're sleeping on someone's couch because you're homeless? This is poverty, not neglect. And the biggest tragedy of this is that we know that currently the child being in the care of the child welfare system is the #1 risk factor for trafficking, for being exploited in this country. We have seen studies, there was a study in Winnipeg that said 70% of the kids being sold on the street corners of Winnipeg were Indigenous kids. And 70% of those were currently in the care of the child welfare system. So they're taking our kids away from our families and our communities, and they're not doing a better job of taking care of them. They were taking them away for reasons of poverty. And I've actually, not that I ever want to advocate for us to be doing the same thing as the United States, but I once heard from someone that, there's several states in the US that have legislation that says you cannot apprehend children for reasons of poverty. The social workers have to provide funds, they have to work to get that family housing, food, proper clothing, to hold that family together, to allow those parents to support those children, instead of taking the children away when the family falls in financial hardship. Can you imagine the different world we would have if that was the kind of legislation was here? Because as much as I hate to say it, if the #1 risk factor for being trafficked in this country is being involved in the child welfare system, it's not surprising that even though we're only 4% of the Canadian population, we represent over 50% of those being exploited and trafficked in this country. And we think of human trafficking as something that people come in container ships or from Eastern Europe and they're being trafficked, but it's not. 95% of the victims of human trafficking in Canada are Canadians, they're domestic. They're from here, they're from our small towns. They're not necessarily from Toronto, they're from North Bay, they're from Sudbury, they're from Sturgeon Falls. And it's when we think of the arguments about a woman's right to choose what to do with her body, and that when we talk about sex trade, that that we need to see this as that we need to look at this being a woman's choice. When you realize that 13 is the average age that a woman and that a girl enters into the sex trade. Even my terrible math skills tell me that for every girl who was 14 or 15, how many were 11 and 12? To make 13 the average. This is not about a woman's right to choose what to do with her body. This is about child abuse and child exploitation. We know that when man camps come into our territories, the exploitation of the local women and children goes up 300%. So we need to start talking with those camps, start talking with the Ministry of Natural Resources when they're issuing permits. They need to talk about how they're going to protect the local women and children, because we know this is happening. And knowing this is happening is not enough. I mean, there's days I don't want to do this anymore. There's days I don't want to talk about women and children who go missing and murdered. Days I'm tempted to crawl under a rock somewhere where missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is not on the radar. I realize I would probably have to elbow Stephen Harper to get out from under to get under that rock. But I remind myself that we can't become overwhelmed. We can't become paralyzed by the enormity of this situation that we're facing. And I had a day where I became overwhelmed, and I was in New York at the United Nations, and I was ready to give up because we weren't making the kind of progress we needed. I was ready to give up. And this woman from South America, she said, I don't understand why you're struggling. She says, you can't give up. You have that hummingbird spirit. And I didn't know what she was talking about. And I just thought she was making fun of me because I'm kind of small and feisty. And she said, no, I see you wearing that skirt with a hummingbird on it. And I didn't have the heart to tell her I wear that skirt a lot because it had an elasticy waist. And after 2 weeks in New York and eating in restaurants, I think it was the only thing that fit me anymore. And she said, but that hummingbird, She said, among my people, a long time ago, when the forests were burning, those fires were ravaging our lands. And everybody was standing and watching and not knowing what to do. All the animals, all the people, just standing and watching the forests burn. This little tiny hummingbird was flying back and forth to the river, picked up one little drop of water in its tiny little mouth, flew back to that fire and dropped its one tiny little drop. And they suddenly asked, Hummingbird, what do you think you're doing? One drop, what difference is that going to make? And without missing a beat, that hummingbird said, I am doing the best that I can. And one drop at a time, we can make a difference, because one drop at a time, tens of thousands, millions and billions of drops becomes a torrential rain, a flood that can change the landscape we live in. They can put out those fires of racism and sexism that can change the world we live in if we all, one drop at a time, one voice at a time, even the smallest whispers becomes a roar that can't be ignored in this world anymore. And we know that one drop at a time, if you've ever been to the North Shore of Lake Superior, you can see how one drop at a time over hundreds of years, persistent for people who still believe one drop at a time can wear away even the hardest of rock. And that's why we need to keep doing this. And that's why I started this story with my mom's story. One woman who stood up against the government of Canada and changed life, changed the rights of tens of thousands, if not 100,000s of Indigenous women and children who could be reinstated because one woman stood up. And if we all did one small thing, we can change the world we live in. And that's why you must never stop believing and never stop standing up and never stop speaking out when we see injustice, because together we can change the world. One drop at a time. Thank you. Sorry.